The room hadn't even finished settling into its chairs when Colin Marsh pointed toward the back of the conference table and announced, in the smooth, unbothered tone of a man who had never in his life been told no, that Meridian Analytics' legacy architecture division was being dissolved, effective the following Friday. He stood at the head of the glass-walled conference room, on the 22nd floor, 33 years old, in a suit that cost more than most of the engineers in the room made in a month, and he spoke about transformation and modernization with the effortless confidence of someone who had never actually built anything from the ground up. He talked about machine learning pipelines and neural optimization frameworks, and the end of what he called, with a faint curl at the corner of his mouth, the hand-coded era. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. In the far corner of the table, a woman sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened without expression. She was 47 years old, wearing a plain navy blazer over a gray shirt, no jewelry except a small gold ring on her right hand. Her hair was pulled back simply. She did not have a name placard in front of her, because everyone in that room already knew who she was, or should have. Her name was Tamara Briggs. 12 years ago, in a one-bedroom apartment in East Baltimore, she had written the first line of code that eventually became the system Colin Marsh was now describing as an outdated liability. She had not inherited money. She had not attended a university with a name that opened doors. She had grown up watching her mother work double shifts at a hospital laundry and her father rebuild car engines in the driveway on weekends, because the garage he rented charged too much in the winter. What she had was a mind that could hold 10,000 variables at once and an obsessive patience for understanding systems at their deepest level. Not the surface layer where most people stopped, but all the way down to the foundational logic that everything else depended on. She had bootstrapped Meridian Analytics with a co-founder who left after 18 months, a maxed-out credit card, and 3 years of sleeping 4 hours a night. By the time the company went public 6 years ago, her net worth had crossed 9 figures. She had stepped back from day-to-day operations gradually by choice, handing leadership to a succession of CEOs while she moved into a senior advisory role. She still held the largest individual stake in the company. Colin Marsh had been brought in 8 months ago by a new block of institutional investors who wanted, as they put it in the board letter, fresh perspective and aggressive modernization. He had an MBA from Wharton, a consulting background at a firm whose name people dropped at cocktail parties, and a track record of streamlining operations at 2 companies he had joined after other people built them. He had reviewed Tamara's contribution to Meridian, the way a new homeowner reviews the decisions of whoever built the house before them, with the comfortable certainty that anything old could be improved and anything hand-built could be replaced with something more efficient. When his eyes reached hers across the conference table, he did not pause. He told the room that 8 of the top algorithmic consultants in the country had been contracted to rebuild the core prediction engine using state-of-the-art infrastructure, and that the existing team's experience, while appreciated, was no longer aligned with the direction the company needed to move. Appreciated. He used that word with the practiced ease of someone who had been coached on how to soften a dismissal without actually softening it at all. Tamara did not raise her hand. She did not challenge him in front of 35 people who were watching her face the way passengers watch a pilot's expression during turbulence. She simply nodded once, slowly, and looked down at the table. The woman sitting 2 chairs to her left, a senior engineer named Ruth Sims, who had been with Meridian for 9 years, felt her throat tighten watching that nod, because she understood exactly what it meant. After the meeting, Tamara collected her laptop bag from the corner, shook hands with the 2 or 3 people who caught her eye on her way to the door, and walked out through the lobby without stopping at her office. She spent the following week wrapping up her remaining advisory commitments, documented everything she knew about the system's core architecture in a set of handwritten notes she gave to Ruth before she left, and transferred the last of her active projects to the incoming team. On her final day, a young developer named Devin, who had joined Meridian straight out of college 2 years earlier and spent most of that time learning from Tamara whenever she was in the building, found her alone in the small kitchen on the 22nd floor, making coffee in the unhurried way she did everything. He asked her if she was angry. She looked at the coffee in her cup for a moment before answering. She told him that anger was something she had learned long ago to spend very carefully, and that she didn't intend to waste it on something she had already decided was inevitable. She told him to keep his documentation habits sharp, to always understand the layer beneath the layer he was working in, and to never let anyone tell him that foundational knowledge was the same thing as old knowledge. Then she finished her coffee, set the cup in the drying rack, and walked out of the building for the last time, with the same quiet steadiness she had brought to every problem she had ever solved. The 8 consultants arrived the following Monday in matching laptop bags, and the particular brand of collective confidence that comes from having the right credentials at the right firms. For long enough that failure starts to feel theoretical rather than possible. They were brilliant, every one of them. 3 held PhDs in computational mathematics. 2 had published papers on large-scale distribution modeling that were cited across the industry. Their combined resumes represented more than 40 years of elite academic training and high-stakes consulting across some of the largest companies in the country. Their task, in Colin's framing, was straightforward. Take Meridian's prediction engine, the core algorithm that calculated supply chain optimization for 17 major retail clients, and rebuild it on modern infrastructure in time for the live rollout of a new contract with Hartwell Retail Group, a national chain with 1,800 stores, representing the largest deal in Meridian's history. They spent the first 2 weeks auditing existing documentation, running the system through benchmarking software, and mapping its dependencies using automated analysis tools. Every output looked clean. Every module appeared to behave exactly as expected in their testing environment. On the night of the Hartwell demonstration, with Colin standing in a glass-walled boardroom across from 14 Hartwell executives and a delegation from 2 institutional investment firms, the prediction engine went live for the first time in a real retail environment and immediately began generating numbers that made no sense to anyone in the room. Projected stockouts in categories that were oversupplied by 30%. Reorder triggers firing on items that had just been delivered. Inventory buffers collapsing in one region while inflating to nonsensical levels in another. Within 6 minutes, the lead Hartwell executive had set his pen down on the table with a precision that communicated everything his expression did not. Colin smiled and told the room it was a calibration issue. He said the phrase 3 separate times over the next hour, while his team worked furiously on laptops just outside the boardroom door, swapping configuration files, resetting database connections, running the full diagnostic suite that the system's monitoring layer had been designed to catch exactly this kind of error. Every diagnostic came back clean. The system, by every available metric, was functioning exactly as designed, and yet the outputs it generated were catastrophically wrong. The Hartwell delegation left with handshakes that communicated patience being held in reserve rather than confidence in what they had just witnessed. Colin spent the ride back to Meridian's offices in silence, staring out the window at the city passing by, feeling for the first time in 8 months something he had been careful not to allow himself to feel. The 8 consultants worked through the night. By morning, they had produced a 300-page diagnostic report that documented every possible source of error and reached, with the systematic precision of people who were very good at identifying what they understood, the conclusion that the problem existed in a layer of the system they could not fully trace because the documentation for it was incomplete. Incomplete because the person who built it had carried most of its logic in her head for 12 years, had written what she wrote in notes she had given to one woman on her last day, and had walked out of the building without anyone bothering to sit with her for 2 days and simply ask what she knew. Ruth Sims found the notes on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the failed demonstration. While going through an archived folder, she had labeled TB handover on the day Tamara left. She had been called into a technical review meeting the day before, one of a series of increasingly urgent sessions Colin had been running as the Hartwell timeline compressed and a replacement solution remained elusive. She had sat in the back of the room and listened to consultants debate competing theories about the failure with the polite frustration of someone watching a group of people argue about a map while standing 20 feet from the person who drew it. She went home that night and pulled the folder out of a backup drive. She read until 2 in the morning. What Tamara had written was dense and careful and thorough in the way that only someone explaining something they built themselves could be. About 30 pages in, buried in what looked like a technical footnote about data ingestion timing, Ruth found the detail that no automated analysis tool had flagged, and no documentation in the system's official repository had captured. In the second year of Meridian's existence, when Tamara was still writing core code herself in that East Baltimore apartment, she had implemented a normalization protocol for incoming retail inventory data, a specific sequencing logic that ensured all data streams, regardless of source format, arrived at the prediction layer in the correct order before any calculation ran. It was not a feature the system announced. It ran silently in the background, 12 milliseconds, before every computation cycle, invisible to any tool that analyzed the system at the surface level. The rebuilt system, designed by people who had read the documentation but never spoken to the person who wrote it, had replaced that ingestion layer with a faster modern equivalent that processed data in parallel rather than in sequence. Faster by industry standards, faster by every benchmark they ran, and catastrophically incompatible with the normalization logic that everything downstream had been quietly depending on for 12 years. Because nobody had stopped to ask Tamara if there was anything that couldn't be seen in the diagrams. Ruth walked into Colin's office the next morning with a printed copy of the notes and sat down across from him without being asked. She set the pages on his desk and told him in a calm, even voice that the problem was not algorithmic. It was architectural, and the only person who fully understood the architecture was the one he had let walk out of the building. Nobody at Meridian had a current phone number for Tamara Briggs. The human resources system had an address on file from 3 years ago. Her former assistant had an email that bounced back with an automatic reply, directing business inquiries elsewhere. It took Colin's executive coordinator 2 full days of calls through mutual contacts before a lead arrived, not from any professional network, but from Devon, who mentioned almost apologetically that he had heard she was spending time back in Baltimore, doing technical mentorship at a community center in the neighborhood where she grew up. He had a name, he had a street. Colin drove there himself. No assistant, no prepared remarks, no security that typically shadowed his movements outside the office. He parked on a street of narrow row houses in the late afternoon, in front of a building with a hand-lettered sign reading East Side Youth Tech Lab, and sat in his car for a full minute before going inside. He found her in a back room with 7 teenagers, standing over a folding table covered in disassembled laptops, guiding a 14-year-old girl through the process of identifying why a motherboard was failing to post. She was wearing jeans and a worn gray hoodie and holding a voltmeter with the easy familiarity of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She did not look up when he came through the door. She finished the explanation she was giving, watched the girl run the test herself, and nodded once when the result came back correctly. Then she straightened up, turned around, and looked at him. She did not look surprised. She did not look angry. She waited for him to speak first. Colin told her the truth. He told her the system had failed in front of Hartwell, that 8 of the most qualified specialists he could find had been unable to identify the fault for 3 weeks, and that a woman named Ruth Sims had found a set of handwritten notes pointing toward an architectural decision nobody had known to look for. He told her he needed her to come back. Tamara looked at him steadily for a moment, then shook her head. Her voice was calm, but there was something beneath the calm that was not negotiable. A kind of settled certainty that she had clearly arrived at long before this conversation. Colin asked her quietly why she had never pushed back. When he announced the changes, when he dissolved the team, when he used the word appreciated in a room full of people who had watched her build something from zero. She set the voltmeter down on the table and told him a story. 11 years ago, in the second year of Meridian's existence, she had brought a partnership proposal to a meeting with a venture group, considering their Series A round. She had prepared for that meeting for 6 weeks, had built the financial projections herself, had constructed the technical architecture argument from first principles. When she walked into the room, the lead partner looked at the man who had accompanied her, a co-founder who had joined 8 months earlier and left 8 months after, and directed every question to him. Every single one. For 45 minutes, the partner spoke to the man standing beside Tamara, as though Tamara were a supporting role in her own company. The co-founder answered what he could and quietly deferred the technical questions back to her. The partner never quite adjusted to looking at her when she spoke. They did not get a term sheet from that firm. They got it from a different one, from a woman who had read Tamara's technical documents before the meeting and opened the conversation by asking Tamara, specifically, to walk her through the normalization logic on page 7. She had never filed a complaint about the first firm. She had never written publicly about the meeting. She had gone back to her apartment that night, sat on the floor with her back against the couch, and spent 2 hours deciding whether to keep going. Then she had gotten up, made coffee, and gone back to work. Not because the room full of people who had talked past her hadn't mattered. It had. It still did. But she had decided, sitting on that floor, that the work itself was the argument she was making, that the code was the testimony, and that whatever anyone chose to see or not see in a meeting room would eventually be answered by what she built. Colin was quiet for a long time after she finished. The room around them held the hum of a small fan and the sound of teenagers talking softly at tables behind her, and something about the gap between that room and the glass-walled offices where he spent his days settled somewhere uncomfortable in his chest. He asked her what it would take for her to come back. She told him not a raise, not a title, not an executive position with her name on a door. She asked for one thing only, that Meridian commit to a genuine structural change in how the company evaluated expertise. That the people who built things in the foundational layers, who held institutional knowledge that no documentation could fully capture, be treated as the strategic assets they actually were, and not as legacy overhead to be replaced when a newer framework came along. Colin agreed without hesitation. She told him she would need to think about it overnight. She walked back through the front doors of Meridian Analytics on a Tuesday morning, and the effect was something the building hadn't felt in months. Engineers who had been watching the failed rebuild, with the helpless frustration of people who know something is wrong but are too far from the center to say so, straightened in their chairs when word moved through the floor. Colin had told no one she was coming. She simply appeared, carrying the same plain laptop bag she had used for years, and a coffee from the place 2 blocks away that she had gone to every morning for a decade. Devin was the first person to see her. He stood up from his desk without meaning to. She walked into the room where the consultants had assembled their working environment. 3 long tables of laptops and external monitors and whiteboards covered in diagrams that had grown increasingly tangled over 3 weeks of dead ends. 8 people looked up. Most of them had never met her. She set down her bag and asked for the ingestion layer code and the current sequencing documentation. Nobody moved immediately, uncertain of the protocol, uncertain of who she was in relation to the work they had been doing. Ruth Sims, standing near the back of the room, walked over, and pulled it up on a screen without a word. Tamara looked at the code for 11 minutes. The room was so quiet that a person walking past in the hallway slowed down at the door without knowing why. She asked one question: whether the new ingestion layer processed data streams concurrently or in a defined sequence. One of the lead consultants answered that it processed concurrently, which was standard practice for modern high-throughput systems and a significant performance improvement over the older method. Tamara nodded slowly, the nod of someone confirming something they already knew. She asked for a keyboard. She made 4 changes to the configuration file, none of them longer than a single line, restoring a sequencing flag that the modernized system had overridden in the name of efficiency. Then she asked Devon, who was standing near the test environment, to run the simulation. 53 seconds later, the prediction engine returned its first clean output. Inventory projections aligned with historical baselines. Reorder triggers fired at correct thresholds, every regional buffer calculated to within expected variance. The room held its breath for several more seconds as the results populated across the monitoring screen. Then one of the consultants near the back exhaled a sound that was not quite a word, the kind of involuntary release that happens when tension drains out of the body faster than the mind can process what just changed. Colin was standing in the doorway. He had not moved for the last 4 minutes. He watched a woman he had replaced with 8 credentialed specialists and 3 weeks of exhaustive analysis and a 300-page diagnostic report stand next to a keyboard and find in 11 minutes of looking what no tool had located in all that time. And something inside him cracked open in a way that a Wharton education and 10 years of professional success had never prepared him for. He did not reach for his phone to call the board. He did not walk toward the monitor to examine the results more closely. He stood in that doorway and felt, clearly, and without the comfortable buffer of certainty, the full weight of what he had not understood. He called an all-company meeting for the following morning. He stood at the front of the same room where he had dissolved the architecture team 6 months earlier, and this time he had no prepared remarks. He told the company that he had made a decision based on a narrow definition of expertise that treated institutional knowledge as a liability and credentials as the only valid form of competence. He told them that definition had nearly cost Meridian its most important contract and had cost it something more significant still: the trust of the people who had built the thing he was supposed to be leading. He did not soften it. He did not frame it as a pivot or a learning experience, or any of the polished language that had been available to him. He said he had been wrong, and he said it in front of everyone who had watched him be wrong, and he stopped talking before he started explaining himself. Several people who had worked at Meridian for more than 5 years exchanged looks across the room that communicated something they had not expected to feel inside a company meeting: that the room had finally caught up to what the work had always known. The 8 consultants, rather than retreating in embarrassment, did something that surprised nearly everyone watching. Over the following days, one by one, they requested time with Tamara, not to explain where their analysis had fallen short, but to ask, with the genuine curiosity of people who were good at being wrong once they allowed themselves to be, what they had missed and how she had known where to look. The first to ask was a distributed systems specialist named Clifford, who had, by his own account, never encountered a failure that surface-level diagnostics couldn't locate. He told her plainly that watching her work had been the most instructive 45 minutes of his professional life, and that he wasn't sure how to train for what she had just done. She told him that what she had done couldn't be trained for in the way he was thinking. It could only be accumulated over time by people who stayed close to the foundational layer, long enough to understand not just how a system behaved, but why it had been built to behave that way in the first place. That the difference between reading documentation and having written the thing it documented was the difference between knowing a road existed and knowing every pothole on it in the dark. He wrote that down. Colin formalized the changes into a company-wide framework he called the Meridian Foundational Knowledge Initiative, a structure requiring any significant infrastructure change to include review by whoever held architectural history on the relevant system, regardless of their current title or role. He created a standing advisory board composed equally of contributors across all tenure levels, and he made explicit in the company's internal charter that demonstrated expertise and institutional knowledge carried equal weight to academic credentials in every promotion and recognition decision going forward. Within the first month, under that structure, a junior engineer who had been at Meridian for 3 years surfaced an optimization idea for the inventory buffer calculation that several senior consultants had overlooked. It was implemented within 2 weeks and improved regional accuracy by a meaningful margin. Colin approved it in a single meeting, the fastest a floor-level idea had moved through the company in his tenure. Tamara accepted a new role the company created for her, Chief Systems Architect, Emeritus. The title meant less to her than the petition signed by 42 engineers and developers that had prompted its creation, a document she received in her office on a Tuesday afternoon and read 3 times before setting it down on her desk. She kept the same laptop bag she had carried since the early years of the company. She still made coffee in the small kitchen on the 22nd floor. She still stopped at Devon's desk when she walked past and asked what he was working on and listened to his answer with the complete attention of someone for whom a person explaining their thinking out loud was never an interruption. On the day Hartwell signed the full contract, after a second demonstration that ran without a single anomaly, Tamara stood near the back of the boardroom while Colin shook hands with executives and answered questions about Meridian's roadmap. She was not introduced to the visiting delegation. She had not asked to be. She watched a room celebrate something she had made possible without needing the room to know it, and found, in that quiet, the same thing she had found on the floor of her East Baltimore apartment 11 years ago, sitting against a couch with 2 hours and a decision to make. That the work itself was always the testimony, and that the only validation she had ever truly needed had never lived in anyone else's recognition. It had lived in the system she built, and in whether they worked. Later that evening, after the boardroom had emptied, and the cleaning crew had moved through the floor, Colin found her in the small kitchen on the 22nd floor, making a final cup of coffee before leaving, for the night. He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. He asked her what she had actually been looking at during those 11 minutes, before she touched the keyboard. She poured the coffee and was quiet for a moment. Then she told him she had been looking for the assumption. Not the bug, not the error, not the thing that was broken. The assumption, the place where a team of very smart people had decided something, was true because it was standard, and had not stopped to ask whether the foundation they were standing on had been built for a different reason than the one they were using it for. She told him that most systems failed, not because they were poorly designed, but because the people working on them had stopped asking what the person before them had been trying to solve. Colin carried those words into meetings where he was tempted to move fast and into conversations where he was tempted to assume. He repeated them quietly to himself on the days when a spreadsheet felt more certain than the instincts of the people doing the actual work, and he never quite forgot what 11 minutes of patient attention had accomplished in a room where 3 weeks of sophisticated analysis had not. Word of what had happened at Meridian moved through the industry slowly, the way real stories move, carried by the people who were in the room, and couldn't quite stop thinking about what they had seen. Other companies began examining their own assumptions about institutional knowledge, about whether the people who built their foundational systems had been kept close or quietly moved aside when newer models arrived. None of that reached Tamara the way it might have reached someone who needed to hear it. She went back to the community center in East Baltimore on Saturday mornings the same as before, sat with the same teenagers over the same disassembled laptops, and watched a 14-year-old girl place a voltmeter lead against a circuit board, and hold listening with her eyes and her hands, the way someone had once taught her to, patient enough to let the answer come to her, instead of reaching past it in a hurry. She did not need the industry to understand what she had done. She had understood it herself for 12 years, and that had always been enough.